Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today centers on one of the most painful and consequential periods in North African history, the collapse of the independent Muslim state, specifically the Regency of Algiers, which culminated in the French invasion that began in 1830.
And this is really such a critical moment of historical inflection. We're going to be examining the dynamics of this catastrophe as they're presented in the source material to try and determine causation.
Exactly. The central question we have to confront is this. Was this historical collapse primarily a result of overwhelming external geopolitical pressures, the sheer military might and technological superiority of the European powers, the Alafranj al-Salabin, or the Franks and Crusaders?
Or was it something else?
Right. I'm going to argue that the overwhelming force arrayed against the region made the eventual outcome almost inevitable, despite local efforts to resist.
And I'm going to come at it from a different angle. While, of course, acknowledging the clear and increasing external threat, I will argue that the ultimate catastrophic failure was driven mainly by systemic internal fragmentation, devastating strategic incompetence, and the debilitating rise of what our sources call internal enemies within the Islamic body politic. In short, the failure was structural.
Okay, so let me state my case by looking at the sheer scale of the power shift, the decline in Algerian military and economic capacity. It directly reflected the debilitating long wars and subsequent weakening of its major ally and protector, the Ottoman Caliphate. Our sources explicitly confirm this relationship, noting that continuous conflict exhausted both the center and the periphery. When the Caliphate suffered, it, quote, reflected that upon the page of Algeria.
That's a sound observation regarding the geopolitical environment, but the materials suggest that the state's internal structure was already too porous, let's say, to absorb that kind of shock.
Historically, the Franks were often contained or, fought defensively in the Mediterranean. But by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they moved definitively from positions of defense to positions of aggressive offense. And this transition was accompanied by a horrifying fragmentation across the wider Islamic world, a geopolitical reality that isolated Algeria completely.
Okay.
And what's more, Europe wasn't just stronger, it was coordinated and committed. The historical accounts detail alliances like the Holy League, or al-Usba al-Muqaddasa, aimed explicitly at containing any Muslim resurgence. The financial mobilization alone speaks to this overwhelming external intent. The French invasion of Algiers in 1830 was estimated to cost a staggering 25 million francs. That is an enormous commitment of modern military resources intended for total dominion.
See, that's where I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because it places too much weight on the expenditure and too little on the preceding decay. That 25 million franc investment only paid off because the internal environment was compromised to the point where effective military and political resistance was, it was impossible. The source explicitly links the collapse to a lack of coordination, noting the rise of internal enemies or collaborators, Ida al-Dacho, who undermine societal strength. Eliminating these internal elements, the source argues, is the key to restoring self-capacity. External pressure, however great, is rarely successful without an internal enabler.
But were these internal struggles really decisive, or were they merely weaknesses that a massive, coordinated external power was primed to exploit? I would argue the latter.
Oh, they were absolutely decisive. Look at the specific, devastating failures immediately prior to and during the 1830 invasion. Their strategic ignorance of the leadership it's almost unbelievable. Al-Agha Ibrahim, who commanded the defense, showed just monumental incompetence. He famously refused advice on fortifications, claiming ignorance of European tactics, and then left his main defense camp virtually unguarded. This was a catastrophic failure of basic military preparedness. One official described him as going to war without organized army, without ammunition, without provisions, and without the necessary capacity to face the war. This level of leadership failure, it facilitated the conquest. It wasn't merely overwhelmed by it.
This brings us directly to the core tension then, the geopolitical context versus local political unity. While I absolutely concede the appalling failure of Al-Agaha Ibrahim, the context suggests that the region was destined for conflict and, frankly, collapse, regardless of who was leading. The continuous wars detailed in our source material were an existential drain, exhausting Algeria and the Caliphate simultaneously.
Before we move on, I have to challenge your interpretation of that geopolitical context. Geopolitical pressure should have been the catalyst for unity, not an excuse for its absence. The sources illustrate a long history of internal rivalry that consistently superseded external defense. I mean, consider early resistance figures like Salares. He was forced to abandon crucial campaigns against the Spanish, who were the major external threat at the time, to return inland to deal with internal rivals like Abdulaziz. When the choice is consistently between fighting a foreign invader and fighting a local rival for domestic control, well, the political priorities are clearly misaligned and fundamentally flawed.
But when you have European powers explicitly coordinating to isolate you, local unity can only achieve so much. France, for example, didn't just attack Algiers, it used intense diplomatic pressure. It made it clear that it would consider itself at war with the Ottomans if they dared support resisting pockets, such as Bey Constantine. This diplomatic hammer isolated the resisting pockets entirely. Even if Al-Aha Ibrahim had been a military genius, he would have been fighting against a continental shift in power, one that had effectively cut off his supply lines and diplomatic support.
But that power differential made strategic leadership all the more crucial, and yet it was repeatedly absent, which just demonstrates the systemic flaws in governance. The problem wasn't just Al-Aha Ibrahim, it was the failure of the political mechanism to select crisis leadership. And it's highly illustrative that they appointed the Mufti Muhammad al-Anabi to military command after Ibrahim's failure. He was described as a virtuous man, yes, but one fit for ifta, but not for command. And ifta, for those who might not know, it's about legal scholarship and the ability to issue religious edicts.
Right, not a general.
Not a general. So in a moment of existential military crisis, a matter of life and death for the state, the administration replaced an incompetent military leader with a spiritual scholar, a man of law who had no capacity for command. That is an unforgivable strategic mistake that speaks directly to the fragility and the political bankruptcy of the ruling system. The enemy didn't need to be strategically brilliant. They only needed to show up.
But even a perfectly designed political system struggles against limitless resources. Let's turn to resource disparity and strategic adaptability. I respect the focus on internal reform, but the material reality of the conflict shows that external resources were the deciding factor in that 1830 moment. France deliberately employed a strategy of istinzaf, a planned strategy of draining Algerian capacity in successive battles. They could afford this prolonged war of attrition because French industrial and financial resources allowed for continuous replacement of men and material, whereas the resources of the Mujahideen were explicitly noted as limited. You can't adapt your way out of that kind of material attrition. It's an economic death sentence.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the material deficit was insurmountable if true strategic adaptation had occurred. Look at the data provided in the sources regarding earlier Spanish naval attacks on Algiers. They fired over 15,150 projectiles, an astonishing volume of fire, with minimal damage to the city and fortifications.
That's true, but...
Replicate or sustain that earlier strategic discipline.
Okay.
Precisely. The system itself consumed resources that should have been spent on strategic defense and technological modernization. Instead of achieving internal stability, leaders were constantly suppressing semi-independent local leaders, like the persistent, resource-draining conflicts against Abdelaziz in the early 16th century, which diverted attention and treasury funds away from the external threat. The material deficit we see in 1830 is a consequence of decades of internal misallocation and fragmentation, not merely a sudden European industrial surge.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on those 15,000 projectiles. The fact that the city was not destroyed doesn't negate the existential exhaustion caused by having to continually face and defend against such an overwhelming volume of attack. The strategy of istinzaf works precisely by draining the treasury and morale over time, even if immediate defensive success is achieved. The French knew they could absorb the cost of failure far better than the Algerians could absorb the cost of defense. That unequal resilience is a purely external constraint. The continuous wars exhausted the population and the finances, regardless of whether a particular cannonball had its mark.
And that exhaustion just highlights the need for a cohesive, centralized structure capable of national mobilization and, crucially, long-term strategic planning. A healthy state, even under siege, prioritizes defense and modernization. A fractured state, by contrast, has to always look over its shoulder. The source itself implies the importance of internal victory, stating that weakening the internal enemies leads to a greater ability to fight external enemies. The internal state was simply not strong enough to meet the geopolitical moment.
Let's look further down the line then, at the long-term failure of ideological cohesion. The internal fragmentation, however severe, eventually allowed the colonial powers to implement strategies designed to destroy the very bedrock of Islamic identity and resistance. A comprehensive, overwhelming cultural attack that went far beyond mere military conquest.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the success of that colonial strategy was entirely predicated on a pre-existing vulnerability? External forces don't eradicate deep-seated culture overnight unless the societal foundations are already weakened by internal compromise.
The evidence points to coordinated external malice that exploited vulnerabilities, but ultimately waged a campaign of total annihilation. They sought to erase the Arabic language, explicitly citing measures like the Law of 1904, and they utilized missionary efforts, which the sources themselves describe as a Crusader War, or Al-Harb as-Salibiyya, aimed at total identity destruction. These were overwhelming state-sponsored attacks on the social and religious fabric that local power structures, even if they had achieved unity, would have struggled immensely to withstand. The external power was seeking not just conquest but cultural genocide.
I agree that the colonial project was malicious and comprehensive, but those destructive strategies only found true purchase because the society was already weak and ideologically inconsistent. The soil was ready for them. The necessity for internal purification was deeply recognized by the later reformists. Figures like Ibn Badis, in the 20th century, fought not just the French administration, but specifically against internal religious deviations, superstitions, and the imported toxic culture that had already taken root long before 1830.
But that reform came far too late. The external forces had already done the damage.
But the timing confirms my central point. The fact that the ultimate revolution, which eventually achieved independence, succeeded only after extensive, deliberate internal efforts by figures like Ibn Badis to fundamentally rebuild the societal base, reestablishing religious and linguistic authenticity. It proves that the internal state and its moral health were the indispensable prerequisite for effective external resistance. The 1830 collapse happened because that spiritual and ideological cohesion was absent. The later victory required the ideological foundation that the earlier state had allowed to crumble.
It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, isn't it? Did the external pressure cause the internal collapse, or did the internal collapse invite the external pressure? I maintain that the external force was simply too massive, too coordinated, and too committed to attrition to be resisted by any regional power alone, even a well-governed one.
But a well-governed, unified state would have leveraged resources differently and made the conflict prohibitively expensive for the French. The internal disunity meant that the French could achieve their goals relatively quickly and exploit the vacuum left by strategically ignorant commanders like Al-Agha Ibrahim. That choice of poor leadership reveals a deep systemic sickness that external forces merely capitalized on.
To wrap up my argument, the historical record shows that North Africa was caught in a severe geopolitical vice. The overwhelming power shifts in Europe, the coordination of powers and alliances like the Holy League, and the precipitous decline of the Caliphate, it all created an environment where even fully competent local leadership would have faced nearly insurmountable odds against forces determined to treat the campaign as a holy war aimed at total dominion. External pressure was the existential defining constraint.
Conversely, I'd say the defining tragedy of the collapse was the consistent failure to achieve the necessary unity and strategic competence that could have mitigated those external threats. Fragmentation, exemplified by leaders distracted by internal squabbles and the chronic inability to select competent military commanders, and incompetence, demonstrated by the disastrous military actions in 1830, were the critical fault lines. External aggression was the proximate cause, sure, but internal decay was the structural enabler that turned a difficult military situation into a catastrophic political collapse.
The complexity of the collapse clearly reveals a profound confluence of factors. It demonstrates that internal capacity and external pressure are often inseparable in the calculus of historical failure, requiring continued exploration of the nuances of resistance, self-strengthening, and decline present in the source material.
Indeed. There is always more to examine when assessing the internal foundations required to withstand geopolitical storms of that magnitude.